Hello, contrarian capitalists. Hope you're doing well. I've got a treat for you today. I'm delighted to be joined by Charles Hugh Smith of Charles Hugh Smith Substack. Charles, how are you?
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation to be on your program.
Really looking forward to this. And the topic we were discussing off air was really to do around the failure of central planning. And you sent over some articles that looked into China and the issues that are going on over there. So what I was thinking is that we should start there and then possibly just work our way across the West, maybe hit on a bit of Europe, but finish off in the USA, and let's see where the conversation takes us, if that's okay.
Yeah, Rob, I think that's the right approach. Is that I think what I'm interested in is central planning globally. In other words, how each nation state deals with it, because it's a reality of life. I mean, we'd like to think that there's like a market that's free, but that's an abstraction, right? In the real world, going back hundreds or thousands of years, politics plays a role in the economy, right? So politics is another way of saying central planning, that those people in charge of the political uh, order, they want the market to work for them. And the general populace, who has the right of the consent of the governed, they also want the economy to work for them. And so we see this sort of interplay throughout history. And of course, we see it playing out now. So I think there's a role for central planning if we understand it as the political will. In other words, if people feel that they're tired of their rivers catching fire, as happened in the United States in the early 70s, then central planning imposed pollution controls. That was not something that the market called for, right? And so, and that worked out, in my view, to the benefit of industry and the market eventually, because it's hard to put a cost on um, that kind of reform. In other words, what's it worth that your river is now available for kayaking and swimming as opposed to dead animals and catching fire? And it's hard to put a value on that. So there is a role for central planning, is my point, and it tends to go in cycles. Like we can see that, okay, people are worried about overcrowding and so on and so forth, and so then they restrict housing. Then housing gets too expensive. Then we need to build more, and then the market's responding to these, you know, political messages like taxation, incentives, subsidies, and so on. And then these are the points of contest, right? Exactly, where are these policies taking us? That's kind of the context I think that I want to work with, not like trying to slam China or any other nation per se. It's just like, what's the results of this if it gets out of balance? And I think that's really what I'm looking at in China, that they emphasized housing. That was a great strategy for growth and to house the hundreds of millions of people moving from the farm to urbanized industrial production. But it reaches a point of diminishing returns. And that's the problem with central planning I kind of want to discuss is there's no feedback in central planning. In other words, if it's working, everybody sort of feels like, well, let's just keep doing what's working. The market is much more adept, if you will, at adapting to supply and demand and, constraints. And then it gets feedback right away. Like, well, our units aren't selling, something's wrong. The price is too high, the demand is too weak, we should stop building. But in China, because of the central planning emphasis and dependence on building more housing, now they have 94 million empty flats, which are used for investment. There's 120 million unfinished units that the developers took full payment on, but they used those funds to buy the land leases and develop other projects, and so there's no money left to finish the units, and so people are living in these half-finished concrete bunker or flats, like putting up tarps and so on. And so that obviously is not working. That's not working for the nation and the public, or for for the economy. So I guess my question, and I'd be interested in your feedback on this, is how do we sort of balance out those so that when there's an imbalance is starting to negatively affect the economy and the public, then how do we what mechanisms are in place to fix that? And China doesn't seem to have a mechanism.
No, it doesn't. It's a very good question, actually. Now, I'm not going to claim to, know the ins and outs of China. I mean, I've been there once, and I've got a friend that lives in southern China, so I do get to chat to him, once in a while. I think what happens in China and then what's reported out of China are two different things. But you could argue that most countries around the world could be the same. I do think that for me, I think you just have to let the free market do what the free market should do. Normally, it will determine it's not perfect. I understand that, but normally that will give you a very good barometer. Like you said, it works in tandem. If things are too high, it might come up with something to try and offset that. But of course, when you're trying to deal with some form of free market structure in a country such as China and the structure that the government has has had for a while is likely to have for a very long time, then I think that's where you get a lot of disparity. So I don't really have an answer to your question. It's a good question. I don't really have an answer apart from just let the free market do what it needs to do. Because if you then try and start subsidizing things and you're trying to, grease the wheels of the economy, well, that just leads to all sorts of issues that we're getting at the moment. That could be inflationary, that could have a negative impact on people. Uh, it's a great question, Charles. I don't really have an answer, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of our point here is that there is always a bit of play here. And what I think my context that I want to share is the economy to me is a system, right? There's inputs, outputs, there's players, there's various interests involved. And so that is the idea of the market, right? Is that all the participants play their role and it's highly adaptive. And I think that that's kind of what I'm looking at in the next decade is a lot of systems that were left over from the 20th century actually have roots in the 19th century, industrialization and so on. And then our communications networks and everything have evolved very rapidly, and other things are trying to catch up to that. So we have a very dynamic situation here. And so, how do we adapt, evolve, if you will, to the benefit of the general public to some degree, right? That's kind of the larger thing is if it doesn't work for the general public, then something's wrong with your system. So
Mm.
I think that's what I see in China is that it's not working for the general public to have been sort of funneled into housing buying empty flats as the core investment for the household. That the stock market was always a bit iffy and goes up and down a lot in China. So people were sort of risk averse. They wanted something safe. And so then, well, here, buy an empty flat, that's going to hold its value. Well, there hasn't been a market there for resale like the equivalent that we have in other countries. In other words, it's hard to sell your old flat because the government is pushing and the developers are pushing the new flats, and so there's restrictions on the market. So that feedback that you were describing of a free market to sort of clear the market that hasn't existed in China, and so they're sort of missing that piece of the puzzle. So I think that they're sort of flailing around trying to adjust the central planning parameters, which is, of course, very tempting when we're in charge, right? Like,
Mm.
hey, Rob, you and I are in charge of national housing um, policy. What do we think we should impose on everybody else? And of course, then it starts playing into self-interest, and then we're trying to protect the developers from going bankrupt because that'll hurt the banks, and all these dominoes are falling. And of course, that's where I agree with you that at some point the market is the way that we clear those imbalances. And there's going to be pain. And it's just the question is, how is it distributed? Is it distributed by people at the top choosing who wins and loses? Or is it more like we attempt to spread the damage and the costs around so that nobody gets destroyed? I mean, there's various, possibilities there. But I think that's how is the pain distributed? So moving on, as you suggested to the US, here in the US, then the housing bubble is real in my view. And of course, I was slammed for calling it a housing bubble in 2006 and seven. And then, oh, voila, it was a bubble. And we can talk about that, but what I see in the local communities is a concern that we've gone too far in the central planning of restricting housing, made it too rich, too complicated, too time consuming. And so locally, I see the governments um, seeking to make it easy now to build a in-law flat in your backyard, for example, or converting your garage into an in-law unit, or expanding housing at the lowest possible level. Like the homeowner invests their money to build a flat, and then that sort of the idea being we've got to reverse this the uh, the tightening of the housing market, making it so difficult and costly to build. And so that's a good reaction. Now the market is still working with those new incentives.
Just going back to China, actually, just a thought that came to my mind is that we're potentially looking at two sides of the coin here, aren't we? Because in China, it could potentially be, and again, I'm making a bit of a guess here, it could potentially be an oversupply issue of housing. And again, there's probably a bunch of reasons why they've done that. Are they trying to look at move the economic numbers as much as possible to make it look like they continue, there's continual growth where when in fact that might not be the case. I don't know is the answer to that. But in China, they could have oversupplied. I mean, I know that, and again, I don't think we're going to touch on the subject of gold necessarily on this particular episode, but I do note that one of the differences between the West and the East at the moment is that a lot of Chinese citizens, and I say this from my friend that lives in southern China, he's been purchasing bullion, and a lot of other people in China, regular people, dare I say, are buying bullion as well. Uh, that being said, I think China's possibly oversupplied, and then I can't claim to know everything about the US because that's where you're based. Going into the UK briefly, I think we're again on the other side of the coin where there's too many restrictions on housing, but that also then plays back to your point that you just made of who's trying to protect who there. And ultimately, I think, you know, if anything, the damage could be, spread as evenly as possible. But I think you and I both know it doesn't quite work like that.
Yes, exactly. And so another point I think that because you are the contrarian capitalist, I think we should look at how markets function. And one of I think the difficulties that I see in China, and like you, I have friends in China, and I visited there a couple of times, and I feel I think I'm a fairly well-informed observer. That's all I can claim. I'm not an insider. I don't read Mandarin, etc. But it seems that they allowed they sort of restricted a diversification of opportunities to invest. And so the Chinese are famously savers, and so they do save their money. There's a lot of household capital, and so you mentioned bullion, gold and silver. It's almost like we want to avoid in any kind of economy, uh, kind of funneling everybody into a narrow channels of either uh, professions or investments. We want a diverse economy as much as possible. And so I think that Chinese policymakers may have made a fundamental error that they're now trying to correct, which is sort of like making housing the primary way that you invest your savings. And so the number that's tossed around is 70% of all household wealth is in housing, which is about double what it is in the States. And I believe, I don't know about the UK, but probably similarly, maybe a third of household wealth is in housing. And so then you're obviously diversified with other stuff. And so I think that's where I'm looking again as each economy and the global economy as a system, anything that gets too extreme, like where all the capital or all the talent is being funneled into one little area, then that creates an imbalance, and then the whole system is like destabilized because it wasn't allowed to be or encouraged to be diversified. And so, when people talk about the U.S. economy, a lot of people who are pro, U.S. economy, or they see it, they talk about its diversification. It's this huge conglomeration of all kinds of stuff. And every economy that's diversified is tends to be more stable than those that depend on one thing. For example, oil exporters tend to draw most of their national income from oil. So then that leaves them dependent because they've created um, this dependency on one area or dominance, if you will, of that sector. So I think that's something we can all agree on is an economy that seeks and encourages diversified, you know, everything is going to be more better off and more stable as it adapts, right? Than an economy that sort of channeled too much capital or talent into one sector. And that's my complaint about financialization in the States and maybe globally, which is so much capital and talent has been funneled into making money with money that we've perhaps sacrificed investing in actual real world productivity, you know. So as an example of how, you know, because like financialization, the financial sector in the US used to be, I believe, like 4% of GDP, and now it's like 20% or something. It's like, well, that's a big concentration compared to its historical average. And so is that good for the economy is kind of the question.
Is that good for the economy? Again, I'd probably there's probably two sides to that. Like I think what I like them pretty much is, if anything, is if you are on the right side of the trade and you know what you're doing, then yes, it's very good. If you are completely oblivious to it, it's not going to be very good because it's going to end up in, I don't use this word lightly, it's going to end up in disaster because it normally does. And I just what I find frustrating almost is that, again, keeping on the theme of central planning, is that we have thousands and thousands of years of history that we can, now I appreciate some of it's written as propaganda, but let's just assume that, there's a lot of history books out there. There's a lot of, this happened, that happened, etc., etc. It seems to me that a lot of central planning mistakes, whether it's trying to control the currency or money, whatever it might be, these basement of currency, etc., these mistakes have already been made. And it's almost like the politicians nowadays either are ignorant to that fact or they have no idea of history at all. Because I'm looking at countries that are seemingly making mistakes that have already been made, but we just seem to be repeating the same mistakes. And that blows my mind. And that then I wonder, again, is it ignorance or are there other factors at play here? And I don't know. I don't know if you've got a stance on that at all, Charles.
It's a great topic, Rob. And speaking of currency debasement, we all know we can go back to the Roman Empire, shaving the silver coins and then the resulting inflation and so on. And we go, well, so here we are inflating our fiat currencies to zero. And I agree with you. It's obvious. And so then I think we have to blame Tina. There is no alternative. That it's the the I think the mindset of those in charge of the system that's fraying is, well, we have to keep it kind of glued together. Grab the duct tape and let's just keep it glued together and maybe it'll sort itself out without there being any pain. Now that of course is foolish. That's not going to be the case, right? The pain, they're simply putting the pain off. But it's like, who is going to get damaged if we let um, if we actually based a currency and limited the supply of money, or that we let our currencies float freely and everybody could use any currency they wanted to pay their bills, well, then somebody's going to get terribly damaged by that. Typically powerful bankers, lenders, the financial system, and so we're under tremendous pressure from them. The private sector, who's as you said, on the right side of the trade, to keep the system glued together, and so we're not allowed to make an adjustment that hurts powerful players, and so then that brings up this whole idea of um, how much power does our elite have? And again, it comes back to systems and stability. When there's a bunch of power centers competing, that tends to be induce stability if it's transparent. Like if we can argue about it and these power centers are struggling openly, then it's like, okay, there's some balance or uh, some solution emerges as nobody's happy, but this will work for everybody. Everybody, nobody's happy, but everybody will accept this. But if you have one like power elite that controls, that has too much power, then they're going to distort the system to benefit themselves at the expense of the general public. And I think that's what a lot of people feel is happening, certainly in the US, that the power elites have sort of run amok. There's billionaires telling, the government what to do to protect their interest. And who's protecting the general public. And so there's that issue, which again is political, right? But we can go back and say, why did the Roman emperors do that? Well, they were protecting their elite to some degree. And also they wanted to sort of fool the general public with their inflated, deflated currency, and to give themselves time to make some other adjustment, which of course never gets done because, hey, that worked. Our manipulation to everything glued together. Let's just do more of that manipulation. So, yeah, how many leaders have a long-term point of view that they're willing to make sacrifices of their allies to achieve? Very few.
And that's a good point. And that brings up various conversations I've had with people over the years. And let's just take okay, let's just take planning for example. So, like you alluded to in the US with supply issues in the housing sector at the moment, it's a very similar thing here in the UK, where yes, projects are getting done, but anyone that has ever tried to go through planning, even if it's permitted development, i.e., minimal paperwork required, you can go and do it anyway. Some of the objections that you get, or some of the things that crop up, and whether this is probably as a result of our local councils, or maybe state level, county level, as you would say in the US. Some of those things are absolutely mind-boggling, and I get, and what I mean by that is that I get that there's, and I'll use this term loosely, democratic values at play, where we should have our, everyone has a right to X, Y, and Z, fine, whatever. But then I look at the fact that every 4 or 5 years you could have a new president, you could have a new prime minister. Well, in the UK's case, it's about every 6 weeks at the moment. But point being that every few years it's changing. So national strategy can change with that. Now I look at a place like China, for example, Vietnam to an extent, and because and Russia actually, I've always said that the East is playing chess and the West is playing draft or checkers. So they're long-term thinking. So if China wants to go out and build a new rail network, for example, or build a new motorway or highway, it's pretty much right. This is where it is going to go. Here's A, here's B, off we go. Oh, there's 1,000 people that live in the way. No, unlucky, but we're demolishing your homes. We're building this highway. 3 days later, it's probably completed with bamboo scaffolding. Genius. So there's a part of me that appreciates that, because this is what our long-term goal is. We want to become X, Y, and Z. We've got all these natural resources. Off we go. This is how we're going to do it. Belt and Road Initiative. They crack on. I like that because you've got a long-term objective. Flip over to most of the rest of the world, and again, if you're changing every 4 or 5 years and your policy is changing, there's no joint up thinking. And I think that leads to breakdowns, and that leads to some of the issues that we live with in the places where we live.
Yeah, that's right. And your conversation about China is and how they can build a new railway system or something by fiat. In other words, like, this is what the government's decided and everyone has to accept it. That speeds things up tremendously, and that's been the source of their fantastic, unprecedented development into an advanced economy. And I was thinking, again, this somehow brought to mind, maybe because we were talking about housing markets, is that you might have seen in the UK, that certainly here in the States, that there's lots of articles that you can buy a complete old house in Japan for $1,000 or $500 or whatever, and you'll have a house for a trivial sum. Just go to Japan and buy this house. And of course, I have no quite a bit about Japan, studied the language, have been there, and have friends. They, of course, have a bureaucracy too. Now it's different than ours, but you can't just go in and renovate that house without, some permits and so on. And if you don't know the language, then you're going to struggle with, the crafts people that are going to do the work, if you can even find them. And so it turns out that you can spend 200,000 US fixing up this $1,000 house. So it's not quite as easy as it looks. And so, and the point of that, I think, is we have to be careful about solutions because there's always trade-offs, right? And so if we go in there and we say we want to get this done, we've traded away something. But if we're going to go the other direction, then we're going to trade away that. And so I think what you're describing, in my view, is when you make everybody a quote stakeholder, then nothing can be achieved because you've given the right to veto to everyone. And those people who see the value in it and want to proceed are overwhelmed by everybody who wants to shut the thing down as an expression of their own power. Like, and we see this all the time. And so that obviously is not the way to get anything done. And as you say, in the longer term. So there has to be some trade-offs like, well, not everybody's a stakeholder. Sorry, in other words, our representatives are going to have to be able to do this. And where's the capital coming from? Well, then who's providing the capital has to have a say as well. And so we have to basically just sort of be part of as a consent of the governed. We have to give our approval to the general goals, but how that's done, we have to let those people who, are involved, run with it, or else it'll never get done if everybody gets a veto. Yeah. And so there again, we're talking about kind of like an imbalance that has to be or disequilibrium, however you want to describe it, that has to be resolved by some sort of an adaptation. And so it's like those countries that can do that quickest tend to do best, and those that drag on or don't allow that tend to do worse. That's my observation.
I think that's a very good observation. It's one that I would definitely agree with, and I think that I guess a part of me wouldn't mind too much if people or politicians weren't so thick. And I try and use that politely if it's possible to use that politely, because if I look at some of the things that, without getting on my political high horse, if I look at some of the things that have happened, we're recording this, our date stamp it, we're recording this on the 25th of October, it's out on the 29th, 30th of October, so it's quite a quick turnaround. But if I look at some of the things that have happened in the last 6 weeks in this country, we have a clampdown on freedom of speech. We have government coming in now and saying, we're monitoring your chickens. So if you own chickens, you've now got to register them with central government, which is laughable. We have all of these financial incentives or subsidies to promote a net zero policy that I'm not even going to get started on because it's ludicrous. And again, that could be, the money looking after the money and, politics, power, things that we alluded to. And I sit back and none of it to me seems to make any sense in terms of they're not doing, in my opinion, what's best for the country. Now, I think MPs in this country, members of parliament, they weren't paid until the 1830s, I think. So it was completely, you had to do it for free. And there was no expenses, no stealing, whatever it was. So they had it done, they were doing it for free. And I think that they probably done things back then for the best of the country. I'm not convinced that's happening now for reasons that, again, that we've alluded to. And I wouldn't mind so much if I could see that there was some progress being made with regards to, and it could be energy security, energy independence, border independence, whatever it is. But I see none of that. And I think that that irritates me. And I think more people are waking up and smelling the same coffee because it's, the government is an octopus. Its tentacles will get everywhere if you allow it to. And I'm not saying that we should have a revolution and stand up and fight the government. I'm not saying that. But it seems to me that more and more people are waking up and going, hang on a minute, this is a bit crazy here, what's going on. Um, let's try and get on the right track. That could be a very UK centric thing, but I just wanted to put that in there as we said we go around the world. Is a similar thing happening over in the USA there at all, Charles? Oh, and any thoughts on the upcoming election or any light on that would be nice.
Yeah, Rob, I think you described something that I characterize as the dangers of centralization of power. So I wrote this book maybe 12 years ago, Resistance, Revolution, Liberation. And the idea that I was promoting was there's what I call sort of fancy philosophic term, an ontological imperative to government to grab more control of everything as the solution. In other words, well, we have a problem here. The public is complaining about this. Well, our solution is number one, take more control of everything. That's the solution always. And so that ontological imperative to centralize power, I see it in the EU, right? To talk about, the chickens. As far as I can tell, and again, I'm just an observer, although my brother does live in Europe, so I have visited. They've throttled small farms and local agriculture because the the amount of paperwork demanded of required for every animal on your farm is impossible for a small one person or a small operation to do. So the road to heck is paved with good intentions, and so yeah, we want to monitor the health of every goat in Europe. That's a laudable goal. But if you're going to demand 42 sheets of paper have to be submitted every month to monitor that, you've crushed a vital sector of your economy to no good benefit because the goat was not at risk of anyway, and neither is the chicken. So I guess my point is somehow there has to be a social revolution, if you will, or a social understanding that the solutions tend to be localized and decentralized. And so that's very hard for those at the peak of central power who are, of course, self-selected to believe that they're a better judge of solutions than the rest of us, and that those that seek the highest power, of course, believe in centralized power as a solution. Otherwise, they wouldn't be pursuing it with such vigor. So we have a self-selecting system that encourages centralization of power, which is the wrong approach fundamentally, because the solutions in a diversified economy have to come from the local sector. And so the solution to, say, housing in the UK would probably be to relinquish all control and give it to the councils or something like that. And the same with like the agriculture should be like in the counties in the US, of which there's something like 3,500 counties. That's where the agriculture actually happens anyway. So it's almost like that's not going to happen though until the public demands it. The consent of the governed has to be withdrawn from concentration of power and awarded to those who recognize the need to decentralize control and power as the ultimate source of solutions, right? And then this is sort of goes along with the free market mentality, and not to say that a market is perfect, but what's good about a market is transparency and dynamic change. That's what we need, right? Solutions are tried, some fail, that's fine. Experimentation is part of it. And this systematically, we can look at like Nassim Taleb's idea of anti-fragility. And that's exactly what he's talking about is solutions are decentralized, not centralized. And you have to allow turn, failure, experimentation, because otherwise, how do you adapt? Well, in the natural world, natural selection, there's mutations, and some are successful, and others, the the individual organism with the mutation that failed dies. And so it's eliminated from the pool. And so I think that kind of natural selection process is kind of our guide, and that speaks politically to decentralization.
I'm thinking that's why I've got a silence. That's why there's a silence if you listen to the audio version of this. So in terms of, and I appreciate that there's not going to be a one solution fits all, but if we're sort of thrashing out a few solutions before we wrap up, if if we sat around a round table and we're trying to come up with sensible solutions to the government getting their tentacles in every office going, what would be the first few things that come to your mind? What would you say? Actually, do you know what? I think we need to do more of this or less of this.
My general idea or impression is that the central government has a role, right? And perhaps its best role is simply to state the goals. In other words, taking agriculture, which is it's really core to human life, right? If you can't grow your own food, then you're in trouble. So taking agriculture, the goal would be we want to encourage local production of essential foodstuffs. Then that's all they do. That's it. They set the goal and then they let the states and counties or the provinces, whatever, do the actual implementation of what that works in their area with their population and their terroir to reach that goal. That would be my general sort of organization. Now, if the central government wants to fund some of that, and gives every local jurisdiction X budget or X incentive to develop and increase local production of food, that would be fine, but it has to be even-handed. Like every municipality gets the same sum per capita or something like that. In other words, some incentives are okay, but not like control. In other words, the control is given to the people on the ground. And we talk a lot about that as an organizational principle because we see how it works in corporations, right? What happens when the corporation's failing and then somebody comes in and cuts out like 17 layers of management, gets rid of 90% of the product line and then gives control of the product line to a handful of managers or the local division. So that's I think works. That would be the principle I would pursue is like set a goal, a national goal or a long-term goal, but then give the power to execute that to the local populace. And there's a kind of selection process in there that if some jurisdiction is completely flailing, well, they're going to lose capital and talent. People are going to go, these guys are hopeless, or they're mismanaged. They're favoring their friends or some other form of mismanagement. Then people will flee and they'll go to someplace that's working. And I think that's also a positive uh, part of this process is that if you want to succeed, look around and use what other people have done that works. Maybe it'll work for you too. And to me, that's scale invariant, meaning that it works on the household level, it works on the county level or the council level, it works up to the corporate or nation state. Look around what other people are doing with your problems, and then maybe they've got a better solution than you have. So but the lower that process occurs and that the execution and experimentation, the more successful that's going to be, and also the quicker it's going to be. Because if you need 3 years to get approval, you're already doomed. It should be like the council meeting, and 3 days later, voila, we've decided this didn't work. We're going to try something else.
That sounds far too sensible, Charles, for a lot of for a lot of politicians and government affairs. I mean, I say that in jest because what you said, I think, really, again, it makes a lot of sense. It really does. Let's start from let's start from the high level of here's the national objective, or whatever that it needs to be, and then is it devolute? Is that a word? I'm just making up words now. Devolve that power so
Yes.
far down the ladder that you get to the bottom and you go, right, okay, we don't have to delegate absolutely everything, but if this is your skill set, do this, or let's do that. Let's go from here. This is the rough framework that we're working within. If that doesn't work, by the way, these are either the repercussions or, people or the label will go elsewhere, etc., etc. And then because you're working towards that objective, then in theory, and again, I appreciate this in theory, you probably see better progress and possibly quicker progress, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, and I think if we were talking about trends of the era, the era that we're in, or however you want to describe it, then I think that's really the sort of framework that would work. And I think that if people, it's theoretical, as you say, and there's going to be huge resistance. But as things start fraying and falling apart, then people will hopefully have more of an open mind and they'll say, well, the system we have now is rubbish. This is not working. So, well, let's give that idea a try. But they won't do it if everything's glued together. It has to get to a point where you can't get a doctor's appointment, you can't get a building permit, the shelves are empty of food, et cetera, et cetera. Then people will go, this is really broken. We're going to have to try something different. And they'll take a risk, right? And that, of course, is part of the market idea. You have to take a risk if you want a return. There is no risk-free solution. And of course we all want that, but that's not realistic. So we'll have to get to the point where people are willing to try decentralization.
Again, I completely agree, and I think that's probably a fantastic place to wrap up. I think if we try and take the conversation further, I think we could probably go on for hours, and I think we've hit that sweet spot. So yeah, Charles, thank you very much. I think that's very useful. I think for a lot of people out there, and I think we've covered a broad range of subjects and expressed various views, which has been good. But before we wrap up, I always like to ask if people have any other final words of wisdom or any advice or anything that they'd like to share with the audience. So, any words of wisdom from yourself, or extra words of wisdom, I should say.
Well, about that flat that you and I are thinking of in St. John's Wood, what do you think is our chances of getting a permit to, put it up into flats? I don't know if
Big,
that's well, that's my word of wisdom. That's uh yeah.
yes, local government and local planning and central planning. It's all fun and games. Charles, it'd be great to touch base again some in the future in 2025, and I think that we could probably have a conversation that goes on for hours. I think that would add a lot of value to a lot of people. So if you're up for it, I'm up for it.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, for allowing me to go on and on about systems and decentralization and all the other bits that I constantly talk about.
On that note, I would say to everyone, and again, we'll put a link into the Substack post that comes with this, charleshughsmith.substack.com. Uh, Charles does a lot of fantastic writing. I've read through a multitude of articles that he produces. I would highly recommend you go and check out Charles's Substack as well. Charles, have a fantastic day and look forward to catching up soon.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's my pleasure.